Good morning, everyone, and thanks for coming. Thanks for joining us at the OurCrowd Global Investor Summit and this session specifically on the future of transportation. I think we have a great group of speakers here with us today who we're going to hear a little bit more from. What I want to dive into in this session are the three key changes that are happening in the world of transportation. And those are really shifting what's going on. And the truth is, it's not the future of transportation because it's already happening today. And those three key shifts are the shift from self-driving to autonomous vehicles, the shift from an internal combustion engine to electric vehicles, and from personal mobility to shared mobility, and the different ways we're going to be getting around our cities. So I'm going to be turning it over to each one of these speakers to sort of give us their thoughts on where we are and where we're going, and then we're going to get a few sort of second-order effects from this side of the audience. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Or Danon, CEO of Halo Technologies. They have a booth right outside if any of you want to hear them a little bit more in depth. Halo is developing one of the key aspects for self-driving vehicles. Or?
Thank you. Okay, so as Yeshua mentioned, we are a company working on processors for deep learning, specifically for automotive. And I would like to speak about the state of the AV from a little different perspective than what is usually been talked about. So as most of you probably know, there's classification to different levels of AVs, level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And lots of the attention is being put on the higher levels, the full automation levels, the actually self-driving car. But as the industry matures, I think many players are starting to understand this is quite a long-shot goal. It will take a few years, not only because of technology, but regulation, society acceptance, and things like this. And what I think deserves more attention is what's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years. And that's what is being referred to as level 2 plus, level 3 levels of autonomy, which is not yet fully autonomous, but does bring much of the advantages of the technology into real life. So, quite interestingly, in the last year, we've seen many vehicles declared or deployed with lots of technologies, lots of sensors ranging from cameras, radars, lidars, which gather a lot of data on the surrounding during the driving. And what is interesting is that this data can be used to improve the current state of technology for these devices, for the cars that are actually being deployed on the road. And you can take ADAS as we know it today to much higher levels. I think the main issue here is the context awareness and being able to decipher a more complex vision of what is happening around the car, therefore improving safety and driving experience. And you can see many demonstrations of this with all the leading OEMs and tier ones in this field. However, as was mentioned before, the main obstacle today, as we see it, is the cost of the infrastructure, the cost of the sensors, the cost of the processing power, and the cost to develop these applications. But I think it would be quite interesting to look specifically at these areas, the lower levels of autonomy, in the next couple of years.
Thanks, Ol. So autonomous vehicles, or AVs in sort of our lingo, they're going to be changing a lot of what we see, but there's some changes that are already happening on the ground. And part of that is shared mobility. If any of you have heard of Uber, Lyft, GetTaxi, Didi, Grab, all of these companies around the world who are raising massive amounts of money. One of the areas I think that's sort of often forgotten are all of the bike sharing opportunities that we have, which is solving, the last mile or getting to the last point in an easy way that avoids traffic. And all of these different modes of transportation, or what we call multimodal forms of transportation, are solving, getting from your front door to your office in as seamless way as possible. So I'm going to turn it over to Ryan Rzhepetki. Hope I got that right, as someone with a long last name, who's joined us all the way from the West Coast. And I think last night you guys had a little bit of exciting news.
Yeah. So yeah, actually yesterday we announced a strategic partnership with Uber and a pilot project in San Francisco, and and yeah, it got picked up by most of the tech media yesterday. So we had a good day. Do we have slides?
Mr. Slide Man in the back. All right, why don't you just start off without it?
Yeah, I guess I'll get started. So yeah, I'll give the perspective of bike share and how it connects to the broader transportation space. And I'm going to actually start in China, where the last 18 months, what's happened in China is really incredible growth and scale of shared bikes. These bikes have integrated locking systems with GPS tracking and a cell connection. A couple players there launched, and in a period of about 18 months went from 0 bikes to about 10 million bikes each over the course of about a year and a half. Just incredible growth and scale, and it's impacted markets globally. They raised about $1 billion, more than $1 billion each. Mobike, Ofo, and a new guy, Hello Bike, just announced $1 billion financing about a week and a half ago. So just tons and tons of capital pouring into the space from the internet giants of China, and why is this happening? And it's the usage that they've gotten in serving those first and last mile trips to the public transit stations has just been incredible. And a lot of the money that flowed into ride hailing, Didi, Uber, Lyft, it's the same pools of capital that are funneling into this now. And I think the other aspect is in China, they never really had a breakout consumer brand yet. They're still kind of working on that, and these companies have that potential. And so Alibaba, WeChat, or Tencent, they see this as a way of getting data that they didn't have before. So they have customers in Western markets where they're getting this GPS data and this account data that they never had before. But it's not been without a few bumps in the road. That's a pile of bikes. A lot of those images had been circulated throughout the media. There's a mass oversupply because the market grew in a completely unregulated fashion, and as a result, there's this oversupply of bikes, and they started piling up. And in general, the bikes are kind of lower quality and shorter lifespan. But the impact was really transformative for these cities. We actually were the first company to ever make a dockless bike. I had the initial idea for this back in 2008. In 2010, we incorporated. 2012, we had the first pilot programs, and we commercialized it between 2014 and 2016. We have product in major U.S. cities: Phoenix, Orlando, Atlanta, Tampa, Portland, Oregon, Santa Monica, California, Atlanta, Georgia, and into the European market as well. We're actually in 6 countries with more than 40 projects and 15,000 bikes deployed. And we took it to another level last year with an electric assist bike. So we introduced the product in San Francisco and Washington, D.C. Those 2 markets are live and operational right now. And we see electric bike as a huge multiplier of the market. It really is the best vehicle for going short, up to, say, 5 miles distance in cities. And so, we've developed that and launched that last year. And it's critical to making that model work is charging infrastructure as well. And so we've also developed charge points for use for our bikes, but maybe down the road that can charge any bike. Lensing back out to the broader context, we do see that shared electric bikes and shared electric automated fleet vehicles as being the future of urban mobility, and these 2 things working very well together. We see one day operating networks of both those things side by side, and it's happening really fast. So in 1900, I like as kind of a reference point, in 1900 there's this great image of a bunch of horse and carriages going down Fifth Avenue and one car, the first car. Just 13 years later, it's all cars and just one lonely horse. And I think that's the type of inflection point we're at now, where it's just rapid change in how we approach mobility and away from the personal automobile and towards shared electric and automated vehicles, and of course bikes being a part of that. And so last piece, again, the bike share boom as in its current form, started in China. And the partnerships with RideHail were a big part of that. So Didi and Ofo are partnered. And yesterday we announced our partnership with Uber. And we're doing a really deep integration into the app. And we see great potential so that when somebody's booking a trip, they can book the right vehicle for that type of trip, which we think is critical.
Awesome. So and thanks for flying in. So I'm going to piggyback on those two trends, right? If we're discussing AVs and shared mobility. And the third one that comes out of that is the shift to electric vehicles. And I know electric vehicles has been sort of top and front of mind for many, many years from a green perspective and reducing carbon emissions. But the truth is the shift that's happening now to electric vehicles is happening from purely economic reasons. Over the past 6 months, 8 months, what you've seen is an unprecedented amount of OEMs announce that they're going to be either stop making internal combustion engines or just increase the amount of cars that they're producing that run on an electric vehicle platform. And the reason for that is very simple, actually. So when you have an AV fleet that's running autonomously around the city, picking up people, then the rates of utilization on that fleet rise. And once you have the rate of utilization rise and those cars are just driving around over and over and over and over again, the cost for running a vehicle on gas or diesel is just much higher than electricity. And so there's a real economic benefit to that. And the second economic benefit is that an EV has 150 to 200 parts in it, whereas an internal combustion engine vehicle has 2,000, 3,000 different parts. And so the supply chain becomes much, much, much simpler. And the cost of maintenance drops as well. And I think over the past 2 months, one of the most significant announcements was that Uber was purchasing 24,000 vehicles from Volvo, or announced that they would. We'll see if that actually happens. And when you're producing that amount of vehicles and that's only one fleet, then you also have economies of scale that come into play. And then the cost of the battery drops. And once the cost of the battery drops, the cost of overall vehicle drops. And I think it's only going to be a matter of time until we reach sort of the EV saturation point. So when you take those three together, the change in how we get around from point A to point B are going under this massive, massive, massive transformation. And the changes that forces on society, I think people are only starting to think about now over the past 2 or 3 years, but we really don't know where it's going to go. And Ryan touched actually on one of the first points, which is data. The amount of data that these cars are generating, or that these fleets are generating, is massive. I'm going to turn it over to Yael to talk a little bit about the data side of things. Yael is from Autonomo, one of the star companies in the Israeli mobility scene, dealing with everything to do with data.
Thank you, Ashua. Good morning, everyone. And again, thank you for the invitation to take part in this special event. I'm excited to be here. This is my hometown. So my name is Yael Rifkin. I lead partnerships at Autonomo. We are a connected car data marketplace. So I don't know if you know, but the OEMs, car manufacturers today are investing heavily in connectivity. They're installing embedded solution in the vehicles. They are investing in transmitting the data to their data centers and storing it. So basically, our cars today are becoming these computer-on-wheels sensors that are gathering massive amounts of data on how the car is being operated, where has it been, and how it's being driven. And with systems, ADAS systems like Mobileye here, we're also collecting information on what's happening around us and in the city. And by making that data available for the car manufacturers in one hand, they have the ability to create a new revenue stream that is recurring, high margin. They have a new way to introduce new business models and introduce services for their customers. And I think the second part, which is the most important one for the car manufacturers, is the fact that using this data, you can create a better driving experience for their customers. And users are willing to share their data, personal data, when it comes to things that rely on their safety, convenience, and TCO. So today, owning a vehicle, at least for me, is a hassle. So I always try to think about how can we create a better experience by connecting this data to different third parties that are going to either improve current products or introduce new services. And I'll give 2 examples on how this can work. So one would be parking. I think 30% of the traffic in cities today are people looking for parking solutions. By sharing, there's no silver bullet. Everyone is trying to solve that problem. We're seeing different approaches. But by making data available from hundreds of thousands of vehicles that are driving around the city all day long, we can reduce the congestion. We can help us have a better ownership experience and spend less time on the road looking for parking. And that's something that would become available once the car manufacturers do open up and have the ability to connect directly with each one of these applications. The second one would be safety, which by sharing the data, for example, we know how to detect that if there was a car accident. And by sending information to the first responders on how many people were in the car, what was the speed of the accident of the car 10 seconds before the accident, what is the color of the vehicle, where any airbags were deployed, this can dramatically improve the actions of these first responders when they arrived at the scene and can dramatically help the emergency rooms prepare for these type of situations. So I think what brings kind of all of us here together, or what will make us come together, would be the data that will be shared from bikes moving forward, from cars, drones, and using one platform or several platforms to share it with these third parties is going to drive this revolution and transformation in both for electrification, AVs, etc. So, thank you.
Thanks, Yael. I'm going to stick to the big data theme, and we're going to introduce a small company who isn't an automotive manufacturer, but you might have heard of, named Mobileye. And for those of you who follow CES or news or anything like that, one of the more interesting announcements that happened at CES in January was Amnon Shashua getting up to say that Mobileye is going to be rolling out their next ADAS system that's going to be in cars and fleets is going to be mapping the world. So Niso is heading up the business development for big data and smart cities at Mobileye.
Thank you, Yeshua. Hi, everyone. Since you all know Mobileye and the big name, and of course the big acquisition by Intel, it's not a topic that I want to discuss about. It's more about our vision of make every city autonomous. So we came up with a solution and a kind of a philosophy, make your city autonomous ready. And by working with existing vehicles on the road and introduce them our new platform, Mobileye 8 Connect, which Yeshua just mentioned, we allow them to use their existing vehicles and harvest the data from every vehicle that is driving currently on the road. That data could be used for autonomous vehicles and HD maps, of course, but not only. We're talking about a full chain of business groups that will require this data. For example, infrastructure companies or city surveys. Yael, my friend here, mentioned parking. So available data, if we know to harvest the data and understand where the vehicles are standing or where is the next available on-street parking, we can send that data to a data center that will then send it to applications, city applications, or whatever. And that vision actually captured a lot of the regulators. We all know that the question of this session is, are we there yet? So yes, technology-wise, of course, we're there. It's not yet on the road, but it will be in the next 2 years. The first platforms and our partnership with BMW and Volkswagen will show that the technology that we have created over the past 18 years is there yet. Yes, it's there, it's ready. And what we need is regulators, and we need the society acceptance, but it's not enough. in order to have a safe vehicle, you need a huge amount of data that will be streamed out from the vehicle to data centers and to the vehicles. And you have to not change the infrastructure because that will actually take many years. You have to use existing telco infrastructure. You have to use existing road, and you have to do it in the next 5 years in order for this not to be another R&D project. So we are taking we are actually leading this model with cities and working with cities mainly, but not only, of course, we sit around and talk with telcos and we talk with other aftermarket businesses, car importers that currently sell and will sell in the next 5 years a lot of vehicles. We want to equip them with our technology so they can harvest the data and prepare the cities for the autonomous vehicle.
Thanks, Niso. Our next speaker is Mike Granoff. For anyone here involved in the mobility scene, I think globally, specifically Israel and the investment side, Mike, who's the managing partner for Maniv Mobility, needs no introduction. So for those of you who aren't, I'll just say that Maniv, I think, have put together one of the best portfolios in the mobility field, not only in Israel, but globally. So, Mike, I'm just curious to hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Yishu. You're too kind. I'm still getting used to not being the guy being introduced to talk about electric cars specifically. But there have been some tremendous comments made. And Ryan, I appreciate the slide with the picture of New York City, because it's interesting to note that 2018 is the 100th anniversary of a milestone in the U.S., which was peak horse. And so that picture we saw of Manhattan with horses and how quickly that changed over. A lot of times change happens faster than is anticipated, and we'll see if that will be the case here. But as has been a theme of several people that have already commented, we're not talking about a singular change, and it's not going to be that we'll wake up one day into a totally different type of mobility universe. But there are several things going on at the same time, and it's a very complex system, and that's why we at Maniv are pleased to be back in companies, including two that are here, Halo and Autonomo, that are providing pieces of the puzzle and will move us forward into this new mobility future that we're so excited about. So, one of the things you asked us to talk about the second-order effects. We're just getting our hands around some of the first-order effects, of course. One of the ones we're most enthusiastic about, of course, is preventing traffic accidents. In the U.S., traffic accidents declined every year for 50 years, and then that trend abruptly reversed about 4 years ago. I think we can all figure out why that was the case. As Or referred to, some of the systems that are even today getting deployed into commercial vehicles are hopefully going to bring that number back into the right direction, because there's a lot of safety involved. And we think ultimately that one of the greatest statistics that I think I've ever heard was the fact that in the year 2017 in commercial aviation, globally, there was not a single fatality. That's just absolutely unbelievable when you think of the scale and when you think of sort of where aviation came from 100 years ago. And I think that's a goal that is worth for those of us involved in ground transportation to aspire to. And I think that the technology and the trends prove that it's achievable, and that's obviously the most exciting prospect. But there's also the fact that, we spend a lot of money on things that we use about 4% of the time. We spend a lot of money then to store them. In fact, City of Los Angeles, about 18% of land masses for parking. And we spend a lot of time that we don't need to be sitting, concentrating on the bumper in front of us, and we could be doing things that are more fulfilling, whether personally or professionally. And so it's all these things that have gotten me motivated to continue down this path, and certainly the entrepreneurs like some of the ones that are represented here, who have such incredible ideas and creativity about how we can come to this new mobility future that we're all excited about.
Thanks, Mike. Last but not least, we have Ramona all the way from Germany, the CEO of Innogy, who, for those in the audience who don't know, Innogy is one of the world's leading energy companies, recently spun out of RWE. And I think it speaks a lot to the nature of where we're going that we have the CEO of innovation from an energy company on a mobility panel.
Thanks. Thanks very much for the invitation and also the introduction. I should clarify, and I was going to start with saying that I am not the COO of Innogy. I think that would upset the real COO of Innogy very much. I'm actually the COO of the Innogy Innovation Hub. And there's an important distinction there, because while Innogy, as you've heard, is a very large renewables-only utility company working across 16 countries in Europe, 23 million customers, and has a very active and large e-mobility unit itself that's working on electric cars. We at the Innovation Hub, a much smaller, but I like to think mighty group of people working in innovation ecosystems like Tel Aviv, London, Berlin, and Silicon Valley, we're actually thinking about what happens when the future is already there. We are investing in and growing businesses, some of which are in the e-mobility space that I'll talk about, that assume that electric cars are the norm, that assume that all of my fellow panelists have been enormously successful in the next 10 years, that we have a lot of the data that we need. But I wanted to provide a bit of an alternative perspective from that foothold in the future, and also from a foothold in a geography like Europe that tends to be quite different from the way that we think about mobility. I'm an anthropologist by training and by orientation, so I'm always curious about how we frame markets and models, so I'll talk a bit about that. And I'd also like to leave you with a little provocation and perspective about the opportunities that we haven't even yet begun to think about and tackle in some parts of the world that constitute some of those second-order effects and opportunities. So a little bit about the Innovation Hub. I've mentioned we are not right in the core of Innogy. Our colleagues at Innogy are doing great things around understanding grid, electric vehicles, charging, infrastructure, smart infrastructure, and cities. Instead, the portfolio that we have built, among the 50 or so companies that we have invested in and are growing within the portfolio so far, and doing about a deal a week, many of which are in Israel, we have 5 or 6 that are more around mobility than not, and they provide an interesting set of observations. Some of you may know Waycare, which has had some great success as an Israel and California company on traffic management and data. The ones that we've actually just invested in recently are really assuming things like a sharing economy. So 3 companies, B-Rides in Hungary, currently exchanging basically car sharing in exchange for free parking at airports, trying to test that model. A business called Rideys, which is providing platforms for B2B2C micro-mobility, including scooters and bicycles in Germany. A business called Getaway that targets the fact that there are, as you alluded to, Mike, in Germany alone, there are 44 million vehicles that sit idle 23 hours a day. And really, wouldn't it be great if we just turned all of those into a fleet car and provided other services ahead of time? We've also got a business called Motionwerk, which is possibly the most ambitious and far out of all of our businesses. They've recently completed a pilot called Oslo to Rome, which looks at trying to create a blockchain-based wallet for e-charging so that people can have seamless mobility across long distances. So I think they're trying some very interesting permutations of what will happen in the future when both blockchain and e-mobility become the norm. And last but not least, a business called Locomotion, which is just now being incorporated, that is looking forward to platooning. For those of you who may know, platooning, very efficient way of drafting trucks and freight traffic, and a way of increasing both profitability and limiting the impact on the environment of freight. So you might look at this portfolio, all very early businesses, all very ambitious, all at their very first stages of funding, and think about what does it actually mean in Europe 10 years from now when all of these businesses are successful. The first thing, and I'm glad a couple of people have mentioned it, is actually the importance of regulation. We tend to think of mobility as being personal, as being the car, and about fleets of vehicles that have people in them. But in actual fact, where Europe is coming from is a very different position. There's already strong urbanization with more than 70% of people living in densely occupied cities. There's already significant investments in public transport and a continuing increase of use of that public transport, which is fantastic. Some of you, just a little bit of trivia, some of you may have heard there was an Adidas pair of shoes made available in Berlin that had queues around the block for it. It included a year-long pass to the BVG, or the Berlin public transport system in the Soul, and a 90% saving, by the way, on a season ticket. So the BVG's goal was to get younger and younger riders excited about public transport. You know, and actually, they don't have a problem. Younger people prefer to take public transport or use integrated modes of transport, such as bikes and trains, more often. But coming back to the regulatory point in Europe, one of the interesting things for me is the way in which regulation can actually shape, destroy, or create markets almost overnight. Some of you may have seen, for example, that the mayor of Paris has outlawed or is planning to not have anything other than non-electric cars other than electric cars in Paris by 2030. That's actually not very far away. The very famous congestion charge in London that everyone declared would destroy the economy has done no such thing, and other cities are looking at it. So I would say the urban centers and regulation in Europe actually offer us an interesting blueprint for some of the market spaces that will open up in the future. The other thing to say is let's not forget climate change. With transport being the only real chunk of carbon emissions that is growing by leaps and bounds, 24% or more of emissions are down to transport. And the European Union has a very, very strong commitment to do whatever it takes to lower emissions, and that will require large-scale infrastructure and large-scale regulation to address it. So I would say that from a European perspective, it's less about the car, technology, mobility, and the person, and more about what will regulators, policymakers, and others do to integrate public and private entrepreneurship. I wanted to mention one example on that. Who uses Citymapper? Does anyone have the app Citymapper on their phone? If you ever go to a city like London or Berlin, a couple of you, it is phenomenal because it's basically a big data solution for integrated choices to make of the best path to follow, and it's getting better and better. After only 3 years in London, Citymapper actually identified a bus route that was under-provisioned and told Transport for London that they were going to set up a little sort of link service. So you'll actually see the quality of public transport provision getting better and better as data sharing is made more and more common. The final thing I just wanted to mention here is a bit of a provocation is transport. I actually came to Energy a few months ago from being the CEO of an impact accelerator in East Africa and South Asia. Now, we probably all know, the stories in China and India of Didi and others copying or using a model like Uber's and succeeding well. But in actual fact, one of the things we discovered was that safe and affordable transport was one of the biggest potential drivers, no pun intended, to actually getting girls to school and employment opportunities. So you basically have 30 to 40% of the adolescents in a given market, like Bangladesh, Nepal, or Uganda, being kept from opportunities in education or employment by their parents because they're afraid, rightly so, of physical safety, harassment, violence, and various other things. And I'm happy to say some entrepreneurs are jumping in to fill that gap, but there's a lot more needed. So a business like Safe Boda in Uganda does what it says on the tin. It's providing safe, traceable motorcycle rides that allow parents to let their girls go to school on the back of a bike. There's crowdsourcing of sexual assault and violence data that's been extremely well received and is helping for transport planning and to bring the issue really to the fore and make it more visible. And there are even things like a business called Portal Bikes in Nepal, building bicycles for the 75% of farm laborers who are women that actually integrates farm tools in the bike's design. So these things are all great, but they're tiny. And the opportunity and the challenge is actually enormous. So from my vantage point of 10 to 15 years' time, I'd also like to just get everyone in this room a little bit curious and a little bit interested into what mobility can do to solve some of the biggest challenges in the world today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ramona, and thanks for flying in for our conference. We're getting near the end. I think we have about 7 or 10 minutes. So what I'd like to do is I'm just going to ask you guys one question, and then hopefully we'll get 1 or 2 questions in from the audience, and then we'll call it a wrap. So I'm just going to keep on the global theme here, and I think Ramona or Niso, one of the things that struck me, I was mentioning the Mobileye announcement at CES, was the room was basically packed half with Israelis and half with people from the Far East. And that's who filled the room. And so if you guys could, and I think Ryan touched on this a little bit in terms of the bike sharing that's going on in China, but give us a little bit of what's going on outside of Israel. I mean, I know the morning plenary with John was full of Jerusalem and Israel, and we're all pumped about it. This is also my hometown, but give us a little bit of a zoom out on the world.
Well, it's not a secret. I mean, and actually jump slides just show that companies, bike share companies, got investments of $1 billion. If you start from there and you look on the Chinese market, you see that the small car manufacturer actually manufacturing 1 million cars a year. So all of this market, and obviously they're now announcing that they want all the market to be electric. So that pushes the market and push all the players and all the investors to invest in technology of autonomous vehicle and energy technologies to support the huge amount of people they have to serve. And actually, China, I have to say, is today more open to do business with the West. And it's much more easier to connect now with car manufacturers and to support them and to support their ambitious plans. And they haven't yet started to compete on the West. We're only talking about the closed market of China or Korea. Those markets are huge, and Mobileye is, I think over the last year we closed around 15 car manufacturers to work with us on autonomous vehicles platform. And that's really the year that we can identify that this market is about to explode into the point of autonomous vehicles and electric.
Emerging markets?
I'll actually just mention a couple things about Europe that I think are particularly interesting and maybe a little provocative. So one is, I think, given this cluster of beliefs around shared goods, public infrastructure, and also just economically the fact that Europeans have less disposable income often, I'm actually going to predict that cars, even autonomous cars, are going to be barred from many city centers in Western Europe in the next 10 years. And that will actually provide some really interesting examples. I'm really hoping that the Hyperloop comes in sooner rather than later, because the other thing I was going to mention is there's a tremendous number of rail services that are faster than ever coming on stream that are really shortening the distances from various cities in the European Union. So as long as you add a Hyperloop to China, we'll be all set, I think, in that respect. But no one has actually mentioned rail yet. And I thought, given the light rail is being built just outside our door, I think it's also an interesting element to the transport puzzle to think about.
Mike, you looked like you had...
I was just going to add on to that because a few years ago I briefly came to a conclusion based on cost that I had been studying costs of electric miles for quite some time. And then when you layered on top of that the prospect of fully automated vehicles that could be right-sized and light-weighted, and what the operating cost would be in an urban area. And I said, my goodness, it's going to be so cheap. It'll be like single cents per mile that actually, if you were in Manhattan, you're not really ever going a trip for more than 4 or 5 miles. Couldn't be more than 50 cents. It'll just get sponsored. And then my twin 11-year-old boys at the time said, yeah, but Dad, aren't there like millions of people paying dollars to go underneath the ground? And, you know, if it's free up there, won't they just all come up? And I said, yeah, I guess you got a point there. So that probably won't work. So the next conclusion I came to is that actually the scarcity in that model is the use of the road surface. And there's a distortion that exists today in the fact that if you're parking on the east side of Manhattan for an hour meeting, you're paying about $65, where I'm sure you could find some kid for $20 to drive your car around the block, and there's no cost to use that road surface. So actually road pricing, congestion pricing, is an economic fix that should have been done long ago, but because of technology, we'll be able to do it in a very precise way, and we'll have to do it because of this issue of congestion, even though the road surface will become much more efficiently used and we'll get a lot more people over it, but still because of the prices, we'll need to price it, and also because governments are not going to be collecting gas taxes, they're not going to be collecting enforcement taxes, they're going to have to make up that revenue, and I think road pricing is how they'll do it.
Thanks. I want to be mindful of everyone's coffee break, but I do want to take a question or two from the audience. So,
Question for you, Michelle. When I ordered my Tesla, I had driven it before and it had the Mobileye in it. When I got delivery of my Tesla, it didn't have it. So I got shipped royally and I paid the upgrade for the autonomy and all that stuff. So my question is to you, given that Mobileye makes adaptable products to third-party vehicles, is there any way to make your product still today and adapt it to a existing either Tesla or Nissan or any other company, not just giving you the beat and the sound that you're going to hit somebody, but literally part of the plugging into the network and being able to drive with you?
So, first of all, it's not my fault, but I have to apologize that you didn't get it. But taking an aftermarket system, and there were a couple of companies that tried to do it, actually, ones that tried to compete with Mobile on that topic, and adapt it to existing vehicle, and interfere with the manufacturer, braking, steering. Regulation doesn't allow it. You can do it in your garage, but I would recommend it. But this is how the regulation works, and it's, you know, for the best that it's like that. What Intel brought to the discussion and changed the philosophy of ourselves is that we are going to take and offer a platform for car manufacturers. And actually what happens now, because of the EV revolution, you see small car manufacturers, very small car manufacturers that are manufacturing their own vehicles for their own needs. I can give you an example of a street scooter from Germany, which is now actually, it was a university project. They are now actually manufacturing post-delivery vehicles for the Deutsche Post, which is DHL. So think about DHL, huge company, and they cover almost all Germany 4 times a week. They need 70, 80,000 vehicles, and they stop buying vehicles from the industry. So we are going to allow them and provide them all the technology to make their own autonomous vehicle. And we're talking about a university project, but I wouldn't recommend taking any software or hardware that is out there and actually build your own autonomous vehicle. There will be a risk, and there are a couple of Tesla cases that can prove it, that it's not that safe even with the car manufacturer technology. Yeah.
thanks.
I didn't hear that. So.
Boring company.
Oh, you want to take it? Yeah.
I'll take that one, yeah. The question was about the boring company, Elon Musk's. As somebody that's, I have an urban planning background, and I love cities, and I love kind of lighter forms of transportation. I kind of don't like what he's doing there. I think he comes from a paradigm of, oh, I want to have a house in the suburbs, and I want to own my own car, and I want to drive there. I have traffic. How do I solve that? I'm going to drill infinite tunnels, which is kind of I mean, I guess it's like definitely a billionaire's way of thinking about the problem, instead of making more livable cities. So generally, best practice is not building more capacity, because the capacity fills up. And so I am pretty cynical about it, but I did see one of the videos where he's like, well, you could just do these tunnels in multiple layers, and I guess it could, in theory, have infinite capacity, but the cost seems really prohibitively high. So overall, I think it's kind of a bad thing.
All right, so I think we're going to wrap it up now so that everyone can grab their coffee drinks. I want to first thank all of you for participating, for coming, everyone for coming to the conference today. The next session starts